The Crimea, February 1945. Victory over Nazi Germany is only weeks away as Allied leaders meet. The man Churchill himself called the true organizer of that victory remains characteristically in the background. George Catlett Marshall was born in 1880 in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and steeped in a tradition that valued duty and integrity above personal glory. His steadfast refusal to claim credit for his achievements has left him one of the forgotten heroes of the 20th century. A small town boy, he went on to direct the first truly global war. He built the mightiest army in history and selected its leaders. Eisenhower, MacArthur, Patton, all obeyed his commands. When victory was won, he went on to bind up the world's wounds. The Marshall Plan made his name a byword for compassion and generosity, and earned him the Nobel Prize for Peace. Churchill said, "Succeeding generations must not forget his achievements and his example." But few, even in his lifetime, ever claimed really to know George Marshall. Time and Marshall's own determined reticence have dimmed the public's memory of him.
He wasn't accustomed to opening himself up. And he said one day, I feel naked in front of your questions because I feel as if you have me on a dissecting table, cutting me open. But he enjoyed being taken back into those old memories. And suddenly it would just touch a memory that was at least 60 or 70 years back.
Uniontown, Fayette County, Pennsylvania. My first very clear recollection is going out to our barn and climbing up the ladder to get to the haymow. Being very cautious and a little frightened, I came to a windowless opening which I could look out of, and it seemed a whole world exposed in an instant to my eye. In this life of Uniontown, I saw what was, I guess you might call the end of an era. The streetcars came in, I guess, when I was about 14. I remember the first exhibition of long-distance telephone. The families there went back to the days of George Washington and his farm, which was nearby. So there was this great life of the nation which flowed through that vicinity. And my father pointed out these historical facts to me. My father was a very handsome man, carried himself very erectly, and was rather sensitive about things and rather high-tempered when he got stirred up.
General Marshall actually had a rather strained relationship with his father. He never seemed to be able to please his father. Nothing he did pleased him, and he was always being jumped on for this and that, and he was kind of naughty in school, and like most boys are, but he was very close to his mother.
I told her everything I did, and she never corrected me, because if I told her, I realized it was wrong, and there was no use in telling me again it was wrong. And what really changed me a good bit was I was very anxious to go to the Virginia Military Institute, VMI. My brother had finished there. He'd done very well scholastically. I was very poor in school, and I overheard him talking to my mother, trying to persuade her not to let me go because he thought I would disgrace the family name. Well, that made more impression on me than anything else, and I decided right then I was going to wipe his face, as we say, and I ended up at the VMI, but the urging came from overhearing this conversation. It really transformed me.
Something attracted his attention, something about the military sort of life, the barracks sort of life, awakened something in him, and from almost that first day, he was set on being a good soldier.
The impact of the VMI on my later leadership was much greater than I realized at the time. I was learning responsibility, particularly as I rose in cadet rank.
Command and discipline came easily to George Marshall, and younger cadets came to dread his blue-eyed stare. In his senior year, he became first captain, the highest honor a cadet can achieve.
My first wife was Elizabeth Carter Coles. She was the finest amateur pianist I ever heard. And I've met her through hearing her playing some of the airs my mother had played, which I'd come devoted.
She lived in a little white house right off the VMI campus. And there was a walk or a path going down the side of her house, and he walked down there one evening and looked through a window, and there was this beautiful girl playing the piano and she had a dark red silk dress on with buttons all the way down the back.
When he was at VMI, he'd stuff things in his bed so that it would look as if he were there in the dormitory, and then he'd scale the wall and go over to her house.
It was a dismissal offense if they had discovered what I was doing. But I was very much in love, and I was willing to take the chance. We became steadies, you might say, and married shortly after I left there.
Marshall served wherever the small peacetime army sent him. The Philippines, dusty western outposts in the Oklahoma Territory, officer school at Fort Leavenworth. Everywhere, he stood out as a leader. But 16 years dragged by, and he was still a first lieutenant.
He'd won great praise and some decorations, but he hadn't gone anywhere as far as promotion, because you just had to wait till somebody died or somebody retired. So that when 1915 came, in a period of dejection, he said, "I'm not sure there's any place left for me in the Army."
With the First World War raging in Europe and American involvement a growing possibility, the Army had real need of George Marshall and promoted him to captain. After America declared war on Germany, he was selected to set up training camps, making soldiers out of raw recruits.
All but 20% of these regiments were recruits, and they had no knowledge of how to drill, no knowledge of how to handle their rifles, and it wasn't a very encouraging outlook.
Eager to see action, Marshall was named Assistant Chief of Staff of the 1st Division and shipped out for France.
I was standing up under the bridge, and these trim-looking naval files were rigging up the gun. And having dealt with this multitude of recruits and their complete ignorance of their weapons or anything, I thought, well, thank goodness there's one thing that's organized, the Navy. Just then, the captain called down, "Have you your ammunition?" "No, sir, we haven't any ammunition." Well, I thought, my God, even the naval part isn't organized here, and we're starting off for Europe. It was certainly a demonstration of complete and utter unpreparedness, such as I've never dreamt of in my life.
Marshall was the second man ashore when the first Americans landed in France on June 28, 1917.
When we finally got permission to go ashore that evening, some of the officers, and walk about the town, it was very depressing. They had just gotten news of the terrible losses when the Germans had thrown back this offensive, and every woman seemed to be in mourning, and everyone seemed to be on the verge of tears.
After 3 years of bloody stalemate, 6 million soldiers had died in the trenches. The Allies could not push the Germans out of France. General John J. Pershing, the commander of the American forces in Europe, was quick to anger and slow to forgive. He refused to commit troops to combat before he felt they were ready. And when he visited the 1st Division to watch training maneuvers, he was not pleased by what he saw.
General Pershing was a very strict disciplinarian, and he dressed down a division commander in the presence of his subordinates. And General Marshall felt that was exactly the wrong way to handle people, and he interceded with him.
He just gave everybody hell. And I put my hand on his arm and practically forced him to talk. And he said, "What do you got to say?" Well, I said, to start with, we have never received anything from your headquarters. I said, we've had a very hard time. We worked very, very hard. The men have had no advantages of any kind, and they don't expect any. But I said they ought to get a fair deal at any rate. I just was mad all over, and I thought I'd gotten it up in my neck. I might as well splash a little bit, and I had a rather inspired moment. Some of my bosom friends came up to me and said, of course, I was finished, be fired right off. General Pershing never mentioned this thing to me. Well, as a matter of fact, instead of ruining me, he sent for me quite frequently.
Marshall hoped his newfound recognition would win him a combat command. Instead, Pershing assigned him a desk job at headquarters as chief of operations.
It is demonstrated to Marshall daily, since he's in charge of operations and training, how poorly equipped, how poorly prepared we are to fight a serious enemy like the German army.
American troops needed 15 months of training before they were finally ready for battle. Marshall helped plan the great American offensives at Saint-Mihiel and in the Meuse-Argonne. He moved 220,000 French troops out of the front lines and moved in 600,000 Americans, along with 3,000 big guns and 900,000 tons of supplies, all in total secrecy. It was a logistical feat of unprecedented proportions and a turning point in the war. Marshall earned a reputation as a brilliant military planner, but he regretted that he didn't lead troops in battle. Unlike his contemporary, the flamboyant Douglas MacArthur, whose success in combat earned him a quick promotion to brigadier general. On November 11th, 1918, the war ended. 116,000 Americans had died. Marshall would later say, "There is nothing romantic or satisfying in war. It is horrible and profoundly depressing." In 1919, the 38-year-old Marshall returned from Europe with General Pershing, who became Army Chief of Staff and named Marshall his chief aide.
Not only did he now have a powerful mentor to help with his career, but he got to see a side of the Army that most officers never saw, the highest headquarters. And this period for Marshall introduces him to the government, to the Congress, to press, and really is a kind of postgraduate education in American government for Marshall.
Pershing and Marshall led a national campaign to convince Americans of the need for a strong defense, just as they were hearing the truth about the war.
In World War I, there was severe censorship, and it was only after it was all over that people got the full story of the absolute horror of the war in the trenches. And a great anti-military kind of pacifism swept over Europe, swept over this country.
An army such as I served in then, the press wasn't interested in them. The Congress wasn't interested in them except to keep down the appropriation, and we got little to nothing.
As America entered the 20s, it had had enough of world affairs. The Army shrank to 130,000, smaller than it had been before the fighting broke out in Europe. After Pershing retired in 1924, Marshall and Lilly sailed for China. Marshall served with a token American force sent to protect U.S. interests. He learned Chinese, tried to get along with a drunken superior, and grew a mustache, which Lilly made him shave off.
Shortly after Marshall's return from China, Lilly fell ill and was taken to the Army hospital. There she seemed to make good progress and was sitting up in bed, writing a letter to her mother, and suddenly she collapsed and died. He felt absolutely devastated.
Time and a new assignment helped him recover. He became head of the officer training school at Fort Benning, Georgia.
Marshall was kept there for 5 years, and in the process, he changed the whole nature of the training of the Army.
It was called the Benning Revolution. Marshall eliminated old methods of war and developed new strategies of mobility that required officers to think fast and for themselves. Marshall said, "We must get down to essentials and expunge the bunk." Officers were made to simplify orders so that any citizen soldier could readily understand. Under Marshall's command, nearly 200 future generals passed through Fort Benning's officer school, including Omar Bradley, Joseph Stilwell, Walter Bedell Smith, Matthew Ridgway.
I used to have these fellows come to my house, and we would have an evening of discussions with various ones taking the lead. These were very interesting and very illuminating. I was a bachelor or widower at the time.
Mother and I were invited out for dinner one night. And at the dinner was this tall, lonely colonel. He seemed to pay Mother a great deal of attention during the dinner. And when it was time to leave, he invited to drive her home. And she told us that the colonel had driven her around Columbus for some time. And finally she said to him, "You don't seem to know this town too well, do you?" And he said, "As a matter of fact, I don't think I could possibly have driven you around as much as I have and avoided the house without knowing the town well." From then on, they really seemed to take to one another.
Once an actress, Katherine Tupper Brown was a widow with 3 children. She and Marshall were married on October 15, 1930. At 50, Marshall told a friend he had acquired a complete family.
It was his first time he'd had any real family of his own. He and my younger brother became great friends, Alan.
Alan immediately struck up a very close, friendly relationship with him and always called him George. And he was very proud of the fact that, I think he used to say that only he and his mother called General Marshall George.
In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt took office as president, pledged to lead the nation out of the Great Depression. He created the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put thousands of young men to work building roads and bridges and planting trees under the direction of the Army.
Marshall took a great delight in developing those camps. He had a natural affinity for dealing with civilians. Perhaps it was because he had been a somewhat rowdy youngster himself that he was particularly fitted to handle and understand these civilian youngsters. Marshall saw in those young men the type of soldier that the Army would have to depend on in a future conflict.
George Marshall was now 53, and he expected to be promoted to brigadier general. But again, the seniority system held him back. Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur found a different assignment for Marshall.
I know he was terribly upset because he took me out and he said, "Molly," he said, "I have some very bad news for you." And I couldn't imagine what it was. He said, "I've been ordered to Chicago."
Mrs. Marshall later wrote that her husband didn't smile for 3 months, but he served for 3 years without complaint as senior instructor of the Illinois National Guard. Then, in 1936, after more than 35 years in the Army, Marshall was promoted to brigadier general at last. Soon after, he was ordered to Washington.
It was understood that he was being brought east to be deputy chief of staff. This was a great change in his fortunes.
When George and Katherine Marshall arrived in Washington in late 1938, the president's attention was shifting to the rumblings of war around the world. Hitler had taken Czechoslovakia. Italy conquered Ethiopia. And Imperial Japan was marching through China. Roosevelt had promised to keep America out of war. He knew that expanding the Army would be costly and politically unpopular. He was willing to build more armaments, but reluctant to increase troop strength. He explained this to top brass at a November meeting in the White House.
I remember the first one of these large conferences I attended. Most of them agreed with him entirely and very little to say. And he finally came around to me. I remember he called me George. That rather irritated me because I didn't know him on that basis. Of course, the president can call you pretty much what he wants to. So he said, "Don't you think so, George?" And I replied, "Mr. President, I'm sorry, but I don't agree with that at all." And the president gave me a very startled look. And when I went out, they all bade me goodbye, said my tour in Washington was over. But I want to say that that didn't antagonize him at all. I don't think he ever called me George again.
Impressed by his candor and ability, Roosevelt made Marshall Chief of Staff of the United States Army.
Been appointed a general while holding office the duties
George Catlett Marshall had achieved the Army's highest rank.
I do.
He took up his duties September 1st, 1939. The same day, Hitler's army invaded Poland, and World War II began. But the new Chief of Staff was troubled by the condition of his army.
The trouble with the Army was, there wasn't any Army, except in name only. There just wasn't any Army.
The U.S. Army was only the 19th largest in the world, with 174,000 men in uniform, 488 machine guns, and 40 tanks. Marshall took charge. He worked to persuade a reluctant Congress to break with 160 years of tradition and enact the first peacetime draft in American history. They finally enacted the Selective Service Act in September 1940, but with the limitation that recruits would serve for 1 year only.
Number 158.
In less than a year, the Army took in more than 1 million civilians, and Marshall took up the task of training them to fight.
Here was Marshall in 40, 41, trying to build up an army. We had soldiers training in Louisiana and the Carolinas in 41, in the fall, training with wooden rifles, some of them. We didn't have any tanks. We had trucks with a big word tank printed on it, and you maneuvered that way. And the war was going on in Europe.
Marshall began selecting leaders for the new Army at those same maneuvers, among them Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton. To make room at the top, he did away with the seniority system.
A very painful period for Marshall was to say to his old friends, you're going to have to get out, you're going to have to retire. I think in one place he retired 400 or 500 colonels. Many of them were close friends of his. He mentioned in one case, I had to relieve the man, and I'm afraid I broke his heart.
No sooner had the Army begun to take shape than the 1 year period of service for draftees was nearly over. Without an extension by Congress, the Army would be virtually destroyed.
The situation which existed at the time of the passage of that act is quite different from the situation which exists today. We have brought a military power proceed on a time schedule from one country to another, in each case directing all of its force to the particular conquest in mind at the time.
Her heart was warm and gay. I heard the laughter of her heart in every street cafe.
Hitler had succeeded in conquering most of Europe, and Marshall was struggling to save his army.
If we were to release men at this particular time, I think it would be a fundamental and a tragic error. Each step we've made, each deliberate move we've made in time of peace in a democracy, where it is like the Selective Service Act, like the bringing out of the National Guard, it has had a profound effect. It has had a profound effect, undoubtedly, absolutely, on nations that are hostile to our purpose and our intentions. And we mustn't weaken that. We mustn't sacrifice a tremendous stride we made. That is my opinion, a legislative matter, of course, when we took the steps we did, to everybody's astonishment, last fall.
Marshall's army had grown to 1.5 million men. Most of them were scheduled to be discharged.
I think that this country should heed the advice of its first president and avoid all foreign entanglements.
Let Europe fight her own battles. They mean nothing to us.
I think we should stay out of it entirely.
After all, this country was built up by people, a great many millions of whom came here to get away from the conscriptions and the wars of Europe
And here was another one come along. And where were we going to get dragged into this one?
People have forgotten today what a difficult time we had raising an army, how bitter was the opposition to certain phases of democracy. Make it quite a struggle to raise an army. Properly should, I guess.
He believed deeply in the Constitution, so that he was working with the Congress continuously during this process to try to get as much support from the Congress as possible, even though the mood of the country was negative to the whole idea.
In the first place,
in appearing before Congress, he found that quite often the big obstacle not only was isolationism, but the opposition in Congress to the president personally. He was asked repeatedly by members of the congressional committees, is this an idea of yours or one of the president's?
He had such enemies that if Republicans could assure their constituency that they were doing it on my suggestion, and not on Mr. Roosevelt's suggestion, they could go ahead and back the thing.
I made that report without the knowledge of the commander-in-chief, that is the president, that I was going to do it. In other words, what I'm saying now is I did it on my own initiative, with the complete concurrence of the War Department, and without any knowledge of any other section of the government service. Because I felt that that was my duty to do it. And that's a military recommendation, pure and simple.
Marshall had such a non-political nature that he was able to be very persuasive. The Congress just appreciated his integrity and his impartiality, and when he told the Congress something, they believed it.
I can't, for the life of me, see how anyone could read what has happened, can see the analysis of the situation of the Army, and not agree that we have to take some such measures as this.
The Congress, by only one vote in the fall of 41, failed to, in effect, disband the Army. The vote to continue the draft by one vote.
I find many intelligent men today that don't recall that when we began to get the Army in some size, it almost dissolved and was only saved by one single vote. Yet that was a fact, almost a fatal point in our history of the war.
Sunday, December 7th, 1941. At dawn in the Pacific, Japanese warplanes set off on a secret mission. In Washington, when Marshall arrived at the War Department around noon, he was told that the Japanese ambassador would officially terminate diplomatic talks at 1 p.m. Marshall wired all commanders in the Pacific, be on the alert. At Pearl Harbor, his message arrived too late. More than 2,400 Americans were killed, and most of the Pacific Fleet was destroyed.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
That they could be so crazy as do such a thing was a horrible shock. Nevertheless, we were all, I think, without exception, were saying, thank God for that. Because we'd always known that the only way of winning the war was to get America in on our side. Well, now she was in.
In the first months after Pearl Harbor, the news was all bad. The Japanese conquered the Philippines. Rommel's army swept across North Africa. And the Nazis advanced on Stalingrad and the Russian oil fields. General Marshall, working closely with Secretary of War Henry Stimson, began planning a global strategy to win the war.
In performing his official duties, he was cold and icy, primarily for efficiency purposes. He could not stand to waste time. He was a very impatient person, and he had reason to be impatient. He had a tremendous job, and the future of the free world really resting on his shoulders as much as any one individual. He insisted on everything being briefed down to one page. I can remember Colonel Eisenhower would go in to see General Marshall and come out, it would be all marked up. And then I remember one day the door opened and Ike's bright smile appeared through the door and he patted the paper and he said, "Hot damn, I got one right." And he had a sheet of paper with no marks on it. You'd have thought he just made an A at West Point. 3 weeks later, he was gone to Europe as a Major General.
The president increasingly relied on Marshall, who served at his side at every Allied conference, often keeping peace among the headstrong Allied leaders.
Churchill very much regarded generals as people who were to be commanded by him. And General Marshall was in a different category. He was in the category of a statesman, and Churchill treated him with a deference that he didn't always apply to generals.
Winston Churchill, I think, very soon realized that General Marshall was a key figure in the whole affair, but also that Marshall was not going to fight battles. He was going to direct a great military build-up and decide the allocation of vast forces.
We had three options. Well, you could make your main effort against Europe, against Japan, or try to do both. And the first decision was we must defeat Germany first.
General Marshall was convinced in his mind that the war would never be over until the German war machine was destroyed.
Marshall's strategy was to concentrate the Allies' military might for a direct assault against Hitler's forces in Europe. This would require a vast buildup and a prolonged period of training. But military considerations gave way to political pressures. Roosevelt and Churchill wanted an early victory to boost morale and overruled Marshall in favor of Operation Torch, an invasion of Nazi-occupied North Africa. Marshall put Dwight Eisenhower in charge, and in the fall of 1942, the Allies attacked.
The men didn't realize what they were getting into. They didn't realize the brutality of the war. They didn't realize the determination and ruthlessness of the Germans. Their training was only partially completed, and Rommel's people came at them in a very vicious way, and rather surprised them, it seemed. But they quickly got over this, and they became magnificent fighting men.
After months of fighting, the Germans in North Africa surrendered, and the Allies moved on to attack Italy. Europe remained in Hitler's grip. At the Cairo Conference in 1943, Marshall renewed his call for an all-out invasion of Europe. He convinced Roosevelt that the time was right for an assault on France, the invasion of Normandy across the English Channel, codenamed Operation Overlord. But again, Churchill wanted to wait.
There were very many difficult negotiations with the British about that. Mr. Churchill wanted him to go into Greece, anything but face the cross-channel operation.
He particularly wanted to take the island of Rhodes, which the Germans then held. And after a long argument, Marshall, in considerable indignation, said, "I'll tell you this, no American boy is going to die on that goddamn island." And that ended the matter.
As the Allies finally prepared for the invasion of Normandy, Marshall built the mightiest military force in history, transforming millions of young men into battle-ready soldiers. Among the new recruits was Alan Brown, his stepson, to whom he was devoted.
He was an absolutely hopeless mechanic. And then he went into tanks, and he learned to take a tank apart and put it back together again. That always amazed me, which is an example of how they can make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, which is what they did with him.
As the Army expanded from 2 million to more than 8 million, Marshall oversaw the production and delivery of everything, from thousands of tanks and planes to millions of boots and toothbrushes.
I remember I was being severely criticized because I had too much of this and too much of that. But I said, well, that delighted my soul. That was the first time that I knew of in American history where American troops had too much of anything. And I was very, very happy that I was responsible.
He would always inquire in his inspection of units to go down, get down to the enlisted men and talk to them personally, the non-commissioned officers. And if they had any gripes, he'd learn about those.
I always had something I could give a division. And if they didn't ask for it, I'd say, how about such and such? And I'd write the telegram right on the wing of the plane and send it right off. But I sent word I couldn't supply the girls. I could be sympathetic, but I couldn't supply them.
I was for coddling the soldiers because I felt that you couldn't be severe in your demands unless he was convinced that you were doing everything you could. He was losing his job. He was separated from his family. He was risking his life. I was for supplying everything we could and then requiring him to fight to the death when the time came. I know I was very careful to send Mr. Roosevelt every few days a statement of our casualties, and it was done graphically and rather in colors so that it'd be quite clear to him, because you get hardened to these things, and you must be very careful to keep them always in the forefront of your mind.
One of the casualties was Alan, Marshall's stepson, killed by a German sniper on May 29th, 1944.
There was just this general feeling of tragedy because he was so devoted to Alan too, and it seemed so sad because Alan had gotten all the way through all the terrible fighting on Monte Cassino. So all he had to do was make his way up to Rome, which seemed fairly simple, and I think all the second lieutenants were either killed or wounded on that day.
He asked me to find the crew that had been in the tank in which his stepson had been killed, and also to take him to the exact place. So I went back with him and showed it to him. And then we brought in the crew to talk to him. And he asked what had happened, and the crew explained to him what had happened. That there was a bunch of prisoners, and the son had opened the turret and stood up to tell the prisoners to cross the road, and when he did, the sniper shot him.
The time had come at last for the invasion of France.
It had been assumed George Marshall would lead the invasion of Europe. And one would have to be a statue not to want such a high honor. This is a world historical position.
That was his dream. That's what he wanted. As I think you know, his greatest heart's desire was to command the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe.
He wanted that more than anything, and Secretary Stimson said, "You're going to let your humility or your modesty stand in the way of your getting that. Now you make it clear to Roosevelt that you want that command."
The president had to make a decision. So I went to see the president, and he asked me, after a great deal of beating around the bush, just what I wanted to do. Evidently, it was left up to me.
All Marshall had to do was to open his hands, and he would have been the supreme commander instead of Eisenhower.
I just repeated again that I want him to feel free to act in whatever way he felt was to the best interest of the country, and not in any way to consider my feelings.
Then Roosevelt said, "In that case, I don't think I could sleep at night with you out of Washington."
Throughout his whole career, he accepted that thing without a murmur of regret or a word of disappointment, but put aside all consideration of self, whatever, immediately accepted.
The United States is fighting everywhere in World War II. There are troops in China, Australia, Alaska, the Caribbean, Africa, troops in England. In fact, a military saying of ancient derivation says that the commander of a battle should sit where he can see all the action. That commander in World War II was George Marshall, and he had to sit in Washington, D.C. That's the center of the battle.
He came to the conclusion in his own mind that he was essential as global commander in Washington, and that with his help, Eisenhower could do the job very well indeed.
On June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord was launched under the command of Dwight D. Eisenhower.
6th of June, 1944, the phone rang at Leesburg, which was their home. And it was Frank McCarthy, the Secretary of the General Staff. And he wanted to talk to General Marshall. And Mrs. Marshall said, "Frank, is it important? He's planting carrots in the garden." And he said, "Mrs. Marshall, this is a matter of supreme national importance." She said, "I'll put him on." General Marshall picked up the phone. He said, "I see. Well, thank you very much." And he hung up. And this was more than Mrs. Marshall could bear. He had said it was a matter of supreme national importance. She said to him, "George, he said it was a matter of supreme national importance, and all you said was, 'I see, thank you very much.' What did he tell you?" And General Marshall said, "He told me that the troops had landed in Normandy during the night." And she said, "But George, you didn't even ask him how things went." He said, "My dear, at this distance, don't you think that was Eisenhower's problem rather than mine?" And I thought there's a marvelous lesson of the delegation of authority in that.
General Marshall would send no instructions to Eisenhower about his action. They reckoned that, well, he's got to win the war, and that's it. He can find the best way of doing it. And this amazed us rather, but that was one of the things on which we could make no impression at all on either the President or General Marshall.
Marshall's own job, he felt, was to keep the press, the home front, politics, off of Eisenhower's back so that Eisenhower could get on with the fighting.
It took the Allies 6 weeks to break through the German lines at Normandy. A month later, Paris was liberated. And the Allies fought their way toward Berlin. Eisenhower wrote his commander, inviting Marshall to visit the battlefield while the offensive was still underway, saying, "You would be proud of the army you have produced."
We had developed our men to the point where they could outmaneuver and outfight the best trained Germans that there were, which they did.
But the whole army was imbued with a tremendous fighting spirit and was remarkably well led. And I don't think you could have found a better, more powerful army in the world than we had in France in 1945.
On April 12, 1945, less than a month before Germany surrendered, Roosevelt died. Mrs. Roosevelt would trust no one other than George Marshall to make arrangements for his funeral. Harry S. Truman assumed the presidency.
When the war started, Mr. Truman, who was then a senator from Missouri, had come in and volunteered for active duty. He was a colonel in the reserve. And General Marshall had said to him, now, Senator, you must understand that this is a young man's war. And really, you know, you've reached an age where you can render greater service in the Senate than you can on the battlefield.
I told him that I'd like very much to go back into the service in command of an artillery group, and I felt like I owed it to the country. The general pulled his spectacles down on his nose like that, and he said, Senator, how old are you?" I said, "I'm 56. He said, "Senator, you're too damned old. You go on back and stay in the Senate." I said, "I'm 4 years younger than you are." He said, "Yes, but I'm already in." So I went back and stayed in the Senate.
couple of days after Mr. Truman became President of the United States, General Marshall went to see him. Mr. Truman looked up at him and he said, "Well, General, who's too old for what now?"
Unfortunately, the conclusion of the European battle does not establish the peace for which we have been fighting. A bitter struggle is now in progress in the Pacific. Japan must be completely crushed before we turn to the ways of peace.
Casualties in the Pacific were staggering. On Okinawa alone, in 10 weeks of fighting, 12,000 Americans died. 37,000 were wounded. 109,000 Japanese died rather than surrender.
The casualties in Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and particularly the refusal of the Japanese to surrender at all, were indications that they were far from beaten. We had to end the war. We had to save American lives.
An assistant to the director of war mobilization came to see me and he said, "I've looked at it and there's 6 different strategies for the defeat of Japan. The Air Force has one, the Army has one, the Navy has one, the State Department has one. They want to get Soviets into the war. And the scientists have one, and they're developing a fantastic weapon, which he then described to me in detail. He said, I don't think the one the scientists have is going to work.
Marshall had overseen the secret development of the atomic bomb since 1942.
Marshall certainly had reservations about the use of the bomb, but after the tremendous losses at Okinawa, he decided that it would have to be used.
Army planners told General Marshall an invasion of Japan would result in as many as 250,000 dead and injured Americans.
None of us want war, and all of us are against war. But when you have the weapon that'll win the war, you'd be foolish if you didn't use it.
At the Potsdam Conference in late July, Truman told Churchill and Stalin of his decision to drop the bomb. But Marshall was not sure even the bomb would force a surrender and continued to plan for a massive invasion. The Allied leaders issued a warning to the Japanese: surrender or face utter and complete destruction. Japan's prime minister had been making tentative appeals for peace.
I was aware of the peace offerings Japan was making to the Russians in the summer of '45. But the Japanese prime minister was unable at that time to direct the army. The army was dominant in these matters, and they could only apparently be slugged into submission, and we slugged them.
Hiroshima was bombed on August 6th. On August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The next day, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan would surrender.
The bomb stopped the war. Therefore, it was justifiable. I think it is very wise to use it.
These proceedings are closed.
In a war unparalleled in magnitude and horror, millions of Americans gave their country outstanding service. General of the Army, George C. Marshall, gave it victory.
Truman called him the greatest American of our generation. Eisenhower said, Americans have never been so deeply indebted to any other soldier. Marshall was 65 years old and looking forward to retirement. He returned with Katherine to their home in Leesburg, Virginia. 10 days later, the telephone rang.
Mrs. Marshall told the story. She was listening upstairs. And she came downstairs, as the wife would, and said, "Who was that?" I said, "The president." "What did he want?" Not a word. Then he said, He's asked me to go to China, and what did you say? I said yes. It was magnificent.
I don't think Marshall really wanted to do any of the jobs he did after the war. I think that he really liked being a soldier best of all. But he had a very, very strong sense of duty. And if people told him they needed him, he thought, well, it's my duty to do it, and did.
Marshall found China hopelessly divided by the bitter civil war between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime, supported by the United States, and the communists, led by Mao Zedong. Marshall's mission was somehow to find a way to reconcile their differences and end the fighting.
Well, it was a hopeless task to start with. There was no way that you could reconcile the Chiang Kai-shek regime with the Chinese Communist regime. Corruption was a way of life to Chiang Kai-shek. And the Chinese Communists, I think, felt the mandate of heaven shifting in their direction. So he came back with a plague on both your houses attitude.
After 13 exhausting months, Marshall again hoped to retire.
I was told that in '47, when he was terribly tired, longing to go back to Leesburg and rest, that he got a message from Harry Truman asking him to be Secretary of State, and that he broke down and wept. I wasn't there, I can't prove it, but so I was told by someone who says he saw it. So there was a lot of suppression of emotions that went on with him, I suppose, all the time.
As George Marshall took the oath of office as Secretary of State in January 1947, no one knew better than he the position his country occupied in the world. While America had become the most powerful nation on earth, war-torn Europe was in chaos, and relations with the Soviet Union had soured.
What a change it had been. Here we were in an outwardly very friendly atmosphere there when we'd parted company up on the front. Now, months later, they're totally different, cold as ice. See, the political commissars had arrived in the meantime.
The Soviet army occupied Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, threatened by economic collapse, communist movements were growing, and the Soviets were arming guerrillas in Greece and Turkey.
Great responsibilities have been placed upon us by the swift movement of events. It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure.
The Truman Doctrine was a kind of a universal pledge of assistance to those who needed help against aggression. And I think General Marshall was very conscious of the limitations of U.S. capabilities. And he worried that it was an excessive commitment and that the military would have difficulty in backing it up.
Marshall set out for a conference of foreign ministers in Moscow, hoping that Europe's problems could be solved through diplomacy. He was not yet ready to abandon the idea of cooperation with the Soviets. The conference was attended by Ernest Bevin of Great Britain, Georges Bidault of France, and Vyacheslav Molotov of the Soviet Union.
He was a very tough person to deal with, and a very hard man indeed. Mr. Stalin gave you the impression of being understanding and being willing to compromise and so forth, but Molotov never gave you that impression. He was just deeply on the other side and radiated a certain hatred.
When the foreign ministers reached an impasse, Marshall paid a personal visit to Stalin, whom he had come to know during the war.
In the early days, he was very agreeable and very informative. In contrast to this, where I met him in Moscow, there he was completely evasive. My impression was I was getting nowhere.
I'm sorry that we have not made more of progress at this conference. I come from a young country and therefore an impatient country. However that may be, our purpose is utterly sincere in our frankly admitted impatience to see that peace comes to the world, to men's minds, and comfort to the people of Europe who are suffering so much.
Well, the world was just ready to be shaken to pieces here in a minute. Everybody's forgotten what Europe was at that time.
It's very difficult for people who even like myself who lived through it to remember accurately how very bad things were.
We needed everything. We needed raw materials, we needed food, we needed machinery, and we needed credits and foreign currency to pay for it.
There was one genuine currency, which were American cigarettes. Even wage was expressed in cigarettes because that was something of value.
Really, you didn't use currency. You used cigarettes and nylons, of which no one ever smoked or ever wore. But they had, in a sense, replaced currency.
And then there was, in the winter of 46, 47, there was this appalling winter in which everything froze up and nothing seemed to work, and the factories couldn't produce. It was really an appalling condition.
Well, it was just unbelievable. This was 3 years after the war. And basically, I would say the difference between 45, the last time I'd seen Germany, is they'd cleared rubble out of the streets and the street patterns were usable. But the amount of destruction was colossal and the amount of rebuilding was minimal.
Here was a situation which was not ever going to get well by itself. There was no way for the Western European countries to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. There weren't any boots, there weren't any straps.
And we were in such a state that we were at the point of asking the United States help.
Most of my mind was made up in Moscow and returning to Europe, where I could see that the disintegration was moving so rapidly that something had to be done in a great hurry.
Marshall had come back from Moscow with great depression because of the economic weakness of Europe, and it demanded action. So Marshall looked in his diary, and he was just going to receive an honorary degree from Harvard. And he got on the telephone to Harvard and said, would it be all right if he made a short speech as well, or said a few words? And they said, indeed, Mr. Secretary, we would expect that. But nobody was expecting that it would be a major statement of foreign policy.
I need not tell you that the world situation is very serious. People in the cities are short of food and fuel, and in some places approaching the starvation limit. The truth of the matter is that Europe's requirements are so much greater than her present ability to pay that she must have substantial additional help or face economic, social, and political deterioration of a very grave character. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. The initiative, I think, must come from Europe.
The program should be a joint one, agreed to by a number of, if not all, European nations.
I broadcast at 10:30 in the evening, British time, and by good fortune, Ernest Bevin was listening in his bed. He'd gone to bed. And I stressed in this talk that I gave not only what Marshall had actually said, but the difficulty of getting it through Congress. This plan would only get off the ground if there was a dramatic and urgent response from the European side. Well, that apparently stirred Ernie Bevin, the British Foreign Secretary. He told us it came like a life belt to a sinking man. He said, we grabbed it with both hands.
He went straight to the Foreign Office and said, give me Bidault, give me the French Foreign Minister. I must talk to him. And I think almost nobody else in the United Kingdom knew at that moment that General Marshall had spoken. But Bevin did, and he seized the opportunity like a footballer. He picked the ball up and ran.
Immediately, we sent a message to our ambassador in Washington to accept the idea of General Marshall. The offer was not made only to Western Europe, but to the entire continent of Europe, which was a great vision of the future, in fact.
Within 3 weeks of the Harvard speech, ministers from nearly every European country convened in Paris to take up Marshall's proposal. The Soviet Union was represented by Molotov, and Marshall believed this was the last chance for a unified Europe.
It was accepted immediately by countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia. And a few days later, we received answers of the same governments saying no, it was just American imperialism because they have received orders from Stalin to refuse.
Shortly after the conference began, Molotov led a walkout of his entire delegation.
General Marshall had addressed it to all Europe. If it had been possible for people to agree on the same terms of reference, then a different future might have unfolded.
I think that one of the tragic moments in the relationships in Europe was when Molotov took his people back from the meeting in Paris. He had about 50 with him.
In fact, I think it was the beginning of the Cold War because Mr. Marshall, the United States and France and Great Britain didn't want to have this division of the world between East and West, two blocks.
Though Marshall may have been disappointed by the Soviet response, others in the Truman administration were not, nor was giving aid to the Soviet Union a popular idea among the congressmen who had to be persuaded to fund the plan.
One day I was talking to President Truman about it, and I said I would hope that because of the importance of it and the lasting nature that will be attached to it, that your name will be associated with it. And he smiled at me a little, I thought rather sardonically, and said, "No, Clark." He said, "If anything goes up to the Congress at this time, in which there is a Republican majority in both the Senate and the House, if it has Truman's name on it, it will quiver a couple of times and then turn over and die."
So how do you get a great big project like this with enormous expenditures through a Congress dominated by the opposite party?
It was just a struggle from start to finish because all America was opposed to appropriating anything. I traveled all over the country. I had farmers, I had tobacco people, cotton people, eastern industrialists, Pittsburgh people, the whole West Coast going in the other direction. And I worked on that as hard as though I was running for the Senate or the presidency. However, when the reaction came, it was a very positive reaction. It wasn't the idea of the so-called Marshall Plan. There's nothing so profound in the logic of the thing. But the execution of it, that's another matter. That's the thing I take pride in, putting the damn thing over.
The leading Senate Republican was isolationist Robert Taft, who dismissed the Marshall Plan as a global giveaway. A lifelong isolationist, he hoped to run against Truman for president in 1948. The chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Arthur Vandenberg, was also a Republican with an isolationist past. Marshall worked hard to make him an ally.
General Marshall thought the thing to do was to build up Vandenberg into a great figure and then get an argument going between Vandenberg and Senator Taft. And then through that division between the two parts of the Republican Party, one would then drive the administration's horse through that breach, and that worked like a charm. But this was part of General Marshall's genius to understand the political orientation of the Congress and how one could get things done despite enormous handicaps.
The United States is the only country in the world today which has the economic power and productivity to furnish the needed assistance. The 6 8/10 billion proposed for the first 15 months is less than a single month's charge of the war. This program should be viewed as an investment in peace. In those terms, the cost is low. It is a difficult program, and you know far better than I do the political difficulties involved in this program. But there's no doubt whatever in my mind that if we decide to do this thing, we can do it successfully. And there's also no doubt in my mind that the whole world hangs in the balance.
They asked him questions, and he answered them all, and they adjourned the meeting and voted 100% for the plan.
It was called the greatest foreign policy innovation in history. The Marshall Plan helped rebuild not only America's allies, but her former enemies as well. In just 4 years, 16 nations received more than $13 billion. European industries soon surpassed pre-war production. The Marshall Plan strengthened European democracy and united Western Europe as never before, setting the stage for its emergence as a giant economic power and helping to provide a healthy new market for the goods America was churning out at unprecedented rates.
The genius of the Marshall Plan was to instill psychologically the idea that there would be a future, which also created greater European economic and eventually political unity. And the dramatic change in the last half of 1948, the first half of 1949 in Europe was unbelievable. People had confidence. They began to build because they thought there would be a future, and that future would be free.
Truman and Marshall had succeeded in strengthening Europe, but faced other crises around the world. Among the most difficult and emotionally charged was in the Middle East. In Palestine, a quarter century of British rule was scheduled to end on May 15, 1948. Zionists had announced their intention to declare a homeland. Marshall believed that the creation of a Jewish state was premature. He feared it would result in a war with the Arabs, which the heavily outnumbered Israelis would lose, and which would threaten Western access to Arab oil. And the fighting had already begun.
President Truman was, shall we say, of two minds about the Palestine question. He had been deeply impressed by the Holocaust in Europe. He was deeply in support of a homeland in Palestine for a Jewish nation. But at the same time, he felt very strongly that we ought to find a solution with which both sides could live and would not result in simply a series of wars.
Complicating matters for Truman was the upcoming presidential election. Early polls showed that he would lose. His political advisors told him that immediate recognition of Israel was essential to his re-election later that year. But Marshall scorned the notion that politics should interfere with his efforts to resolve the Palestine dilemma. As the deadline for British withdrawal approached, Marshall instructed his UN delegation to gather support for a United Nations trusteeship to govern Palestine in order to buy time until a permanent peace could be negotiated. But Truman was still undecided. Just 2 days before the deadline, he called Secretary Marshall to the White House for a final discussion of the issue.
We met that afternoon. General Marshall started off with a brief statement. He said, there are 35 million Arabs and 400,000 Jews. And the 35 million Arabs are going to push the 400,000 Jews into the Mediterranean. It was then my turn. I spoke for about 20 minutes. I described the factors that were present. I said it was going to come about anyway, that the war had already started, and a trusteeship would not last, and that we should support them. As I spoke, I could see General Marshall's face getting redder and redder and redder. When I finished, he almost exploded. He said, that position is dead wrong, Mr. President. And it's clear to me that that position is being taken for purely political purposes. To let you know how strongly I feel about this issue, he said, if you follow the recommendation that Clifford has made, I will be unable to vote for you as president in the election this November. Well, we all just sat back. That took our breath away. I had never heard a president threatened in that manner before. Well, the president knew that we must end this dreadful meeting and said, well, thank you very much, General. I do understand your position. I'm much obliged for coming over. And they left. They left with General Marshall stalking angrily from the room. Fact is, he was so angry at me, he never directed a remark at me from that time on.
With only hours to go before the deadline, President Truman finally decided in favor of recognition.
There was a rumor in Washington that General Marshall might resign. The general had also heard the rumor. He said, it never entered my mind to resign. When I took this position as Secretary of State, I took it at the request of the President, and I did it with the understanding in my own mind that when the President made decisions, that became the decision of my government, and I would follow those decisions. So he said, I will go on about my business. The President has made the decision. The matter is over.
In one of the greatest political upsets in American history, Harry Truman was re-elected president in November 1948.
Nobody thought Mr. Truman was going to win the election. I remember General Marshall was at the Inter-Allied Club in Paris at some sort of a reception when I brought him in the news of Mr. Truman's election. And he said, go and send the following message to President Truman. Congratulations on the greatest one-man victory in American political history.
Marshall was 68 years old and exhausted. By his own count, he had taken off just 19 days since World War II began. In January 1949, he stepped down as Secretary of State.
As for my future plans, they don't go much further than Mrs. Marshall and myself returning to the house to sit down and rest up from this pleasant ordeal, which I might say is probably my final appearance in such matters.
Because he thought that his life's work was over with, and he was just going to settle in and be a good country farmer at that point. And he loved to work in the garden.
We would go out there and weed under his direction. He liked very much this feeling that he was sort of king of his garden and we were his helpers there. He loved to reminisce about early days in China and his VMI days, and occasionally we would play Chinese checkers, a hurried game with all sorts of little different colored marbles. And he was extremely good at it and always beat me. He was competitive. He liked to win. He and Tupper, my son, would play regular checkers once in a while, and he wouldn't even let a little 6-year-old boy win if he could help it. Tupper said he would often reduce him to tears by always beating him.
He'd just been looking forward to it for so long, just to be able to relax and enjoy the place there. But that didn't last very long. It was very soon that he was called to other duties.
On June 25, 1950, North Korean troops invaded South Korea. The United Nations authorized military action in South Korea's defense, and President Truman sent American troops.
We demobilized, so you know, and we only had 3 divisions in line. The rest were all South Korean troops. It was clearly evident, no possibility of taking the offensive.
Faced with the need to rebuild the American Army, Harry Truman once again called on George Marshall, this time to serve as Secretary of Defense. Though many Republicans now blamed Marshall for everything from Pearl Harbor to somehow losing China to the communists, the Senate waived a rule prohibiting a soldier from serving as Secretary of Defense and confirmed the 69-year-old Marshall.
I was getting rather hardened to coming in when everything had gone to pot, and darned if I didn't find the same thing when I came into the Korean War. There wasn't anything. They'll spend billions as a result of the war, and they won't spend $1 million or $2 million to prevent the war.
Marshall doubled the size of the Army in 6 months, and he had to contend with the bold but difficult Douglas MacArthur, commander of the UN forces in Korea. He supported MacArthur as he pushed the North Korean troops all the way to the Chinese border. But then MacArthur demanded permission to bomb China. Truman said no, unwilling to risk a global conflict. Then, just as Truman and Marshall were trying to arrange peace talks, MacArthur took his case public, declaring there is no substitute for victory and threatening full-scale war.
MacArthur had been making statements on policy in the government, which he had no right to do. The policy is made at headquarters in Washington by the President and his cabinet.
President Truman called General Marshall and said, "Are you aware of the problems with MacArthur?" And General Marshall said, "Yes, Mr. President, I am." And the President said, "I want you to look over the problem, call in the proper people, and make a recommendation to me as to what we should do."
General Marshall had read all the messages by that time, and he made the statement to me. He said, Mr. President, you ought to fire him, and I did.
On April 11th, 1951, Douglas MacArthur was relieved of his command. He was replaced by General Matthew Ridgway.
This reporter of the Baltimore Sun came up and said, "Congratulations are in order." And I must have looked awful stupid, or more so than usual, and I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And I walked away. He didn't say anything more. Oh, he already knew that MacArthur had been relieved.
When General Ridgway, I think it was, took over, we felt that American policy was more coherent and more related to the policies with which all of us had entered the Korean War, a limited war to secure a limited position. Of course, General MacArthur was a hero to a great part of the American public. He came back to a hero's welcome.
To MacArthur's many admirers, Marshall was the villain, and ambitious politicians seized the opportunity to attack him. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin launched a 60,000-word assault on the Senate floor, claiming Marshall had made common cause with Joseph Stalin.
There were imputations that there was something treasonable about George Marshall, of all people, and front man for traitors and all that utter nonsense. Imagine speaking of this great patriot, this great soldier in those terms, but that was the atmosphere.
I was furious, and I said, "Colonel Marshall, why don't you say something to that?" And I said a bad word, called him a bad name, which I will not repeat now because Colonel Marshall got mad at me for using it. And he said, "I will never, ever recognize or give the dignity of a response."
It was a much broader front than just McCarthy. McCarthy was a minor member of the right wing of the Republican Party at that time. The attack against General Marshall was by the Republican Party. They looked upon General Marshall as being the strongest person in the Democratic Party. They thought that they could win the next election if they could discredit General Marshall.
"God bless democracy," Marshall once said. "I approve of it highly, but I suffer from it greatly." In September 1951, after 50 years of service to his country, Marshall left public office for the last time, just before the 1952 presidential campaign got underway.
General Eisenhower was traveling about the country, of course, making political speeches. When he reached Wisconsin, he spent some time in Wisconsin with Senator Joseph McCarthy. And in the speech that General Eisenhower was preparing to deliver in Wisconsin that day, he had a paragraph in there praising General Marshall. At Senator McCarthy's request, General Eisenhower took that paragraph out of the speech. However, he took it out too late. In the oral delivery, he left it out, but the speech had already been distributed to the press, so the press knew about it. They knew that there had been a paragraph in there praising him, and they knew that General Eisenhower would take it out. It infuriated President Truman. It really maddened him.
Eisenhower refused to stand up for General Marshall. And this seemed to me to be an unspeakable dereliction in fairness, duty, and character.
Marshall had made him, really, gave him his career, because he saw something very exceptional in Ike when he was a rather young officer. And Ike, as a candidate, simply did not lash out at Marshall's enemies as we all thought he should have done.
Well, General Marshall would never express any emotion about anything like that. And he never said anything one way or the other. I think Mother was upset with General Eisenhower that he hadn't risen to the occasion and defended General Marshall at a time when she felt he should have.
General Eisenhower made sort of a backhanded apology for not repudiating Senator McCarthy up in Wisconsin. And all the newspaper people wanted to know if he cared to make a comment on Eisenhower. He says, "No, I don't want to say anything about that, no comment. You heard what the president said, but I'll tell you about what the blackbirds are doing to my dwarf marigolds at Leesburg." And That appeared in all the papers, and some people would send in suggestions how to get rid of them.
As George and Katherine Marshall settled into their long-awaited retirement, once again, the phone rang.
General Carter called up. It said the general was honored with the Nobel Peace Prize. So I went in to tell him, he says, how the hell did that happen? Of course, it was announced over the air, you know, and of course the telegrams were coming in like flies.
George Catlett Marshall was the only soldier ever to win the Nobel Prize for Peace.
Them gold medal.
I accept this honor with profound gratitude, and I do it not merely for myself, more especially for the American people who alone made possible the authority and possible the funds which made the European recovery program a reality. Thank you very much.
Some questioned the awarding of the Peace Prize to a soldier. George Marshall saw no contradiction.
At the later white tie dinner, Marshall said, "The cost of war is constantly spread before me, written neatly in many ledgers whose columns are gravestones. For that reason, I'm constantly moved to find a means to prevent the calamity of war."
He felt that everything he had done was the property of the United States of America, that he was merely the go-between between the people and history. He said that there was no way he could capitalize in any way, shape, or form, nor did he want to hurt people, and consequently, he was not going to write his biography. That was, to me, a measure of the man, far beyond. He'd been offered, we were told, $1 million just to write something for Life magazine. But we pointed out that it wasn't fair to the public not to have at least an authorized biography. And that's when we started the tapes.
At first, I thought I was not going to get him to talk in the mic at all, because he acted as if he was afraid of it. And that's when I made the remark, General Marshall, you'd better tell me some of the things, or the Freudians will get you. And he laughed. He ended up talking about practically anything I asked him about.
In January 1959, soon after his 78th birthday, George Marshall suffered a crippling stroke.
I went down right away to be with Mother. And I went over to see him, and he looked up at me and he said, "Molly, what on earth are you doing here?" And that's the last time I remember him saying anything that was to the point, you know. And then he just sort of went into a coma, I guess they call it, I don't know. And then they moved him to Washington.
I called up Mrs. Marshall, who was staying in the guest house at Walter Reed, and asked if I could come to see him. And she said, yes, come ahead. So we went up there, and he, of course, had had a stroke, and she left the room briefly. And he was sleeping. And he looked so peaceful. He looked like I'd seen him 1,000 times when I was a child. And when he was very, very tired, he'd go to bed and he'd say, "Oh, man, this bed feels good to I." And then he'd fall on the bed and go to sleep. And he got that from the comic strip in the Gumps. And when I left him, I leaned over and kissed him and whispered, "Oh, man." I won't forget that. So I left, and I thought he deserved a long rest.
And this particular night, I went over, and I got off the elevator, private elevator, and I was going in towards the room, and one of the officers and the lieutenant come running down and shouting to get the oxygen tank. General's grasping. So this fellow ran and got the tank air, and I went in the room with him, and see, there was nobody sitting in with him, but they should have been, I think. And anyway, I don't know, it wouldn't have made any difference anyway, I don't think. And he died there, and I was there with him.
George Marshall died on October 16, 1959. As the general had requested, there was no ceremonial procession, no lying in state at the Capitol Rotunda. Mrs. Marshall arranged to have the unopened coffin rest overnight in a Washington chapel, and large crowds gathered to pay their final respects. On October 20th, the funeral was held at a small chapel at Fort Myer.
It was a sad time, but it was a homecoming, too, because I can't think of a single close associate of General Marshall who wasn't there. I say it was a gathering of the Marshall alumni, if you will. And there was no weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. It was a solemn occasion, but it was a reverent occasion, I guess that's the word. Then from there we marched down to behind the tomb of the unknown soldier and buried him.